Bienvenue. Welcome. I'm Professor Jean Cohen from the Political Science Department, but in a different incarnation, I was a sociologist, as is Michel Wieviorka, I hope. And it is a great pleasure for me to introduce Michel Wieviorka to you. I'm probably mispronouncing Wieviorka, but I try. And I just found out, to my utter astonishment, that this is the first time he has come to Columbia, which is a scandal for all of you sociologists. It won't be the last time, but it is the first time, and it's about time. In any case, I actually met Wieviorka, I think, almost 30 years ago, which is alarming, in the context of work on social movements with Alain Touraine. But Michel Wieviorka now is well, let me put it this way. He was a member of CADIS, which was the lab, the working group founded by Alain Touraine, and he became the director of the center in 1981. Michel Wieviorka stepped down from that position in 2009 to become the director of the Fondation Maison des Sciences de l'Homme, which all of you should realize is an important institution in France, to say the least. And he is currently also a professor at EHESS, the Ecole des Hautes Etudes en Sciences Sociales, among other positions, but these are the main ones now, right? He is the author of many, many books. He's on the board of many, many journals. His books have been translated into English, many of them. Among, I cannot list them all because that would take up the entire time of the lecture, but starting from a book on l'État, le patronat et les consommateurs in 1977, and culminating in a book which I think just came out, called Pour la prochaine gauche, le monde change, la gauche aussi doit changer, we hope springs eternal, which just came out in 2011. Clearly this will be have something to do with the presentation today, but in between, just so you know, the range of the work, he has written on and directed major work on social movements, on religion, on multiculturalism. I'm probably leaving something out. In any case, terrorism, how could I forget that? In any case, I'm pleased and honored that Michel Wieviorka is finally here to give us a lecture. Thank you.
Let me thank Jean, who is an old friend, I see that you understand. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here, to meet some friends, recent friends or older friends, and it's true, it's my first time in Columbia. For me, New York stops more or less at 62 or 65th Street, something like that. You know, the northern part of Manhattan for me is a place I did not know before. So it's a discovery and it's a pleasure. And the Maison Française is a wonderful place. And I want to thank the people, Shani and Emmanuel Sada, who could not be here tonight, but that organized with my visit here. So, before really starting with what I want to tell you, I just want to tell you, it's not an introduction, it's a precision. I am known in my country as being left politically, left-oriented, but what I'm going to say, which is connected with this, but as is not political. I mean, it's not politicien, the French people would say. To say it's an analysis. Maybe somebody who would be more right-oriented could make the same kind of analysis, but for the right. That's what I'm going to say for the left, which is my family. But I'm not going to defend any left tonight. It's not my purpose. And my idea tonight is to tell you that I think that the moment has come in some countries, at least. I don't want to generalize too much, but in some countries at least, my country, France, and other European countries, and I'm thinking about Italy first of all, the moment has come to try to see why the left is so weak or has so many difficulties to appear, as it sometimes appeared in other historical moments, And my idea is to try to say something like, we should try to connect political orientations, in my case, left, with other people, right? So we should try to articulate these orientations with what sociology or social science can bring. How can we connect sociological analysis and political convictions, to say it like that? And maybe if we try to do this, maybe we can have new ideas, and maybe we could, I don't know the English word, the French translating Max Weber said, le réenchantement, not the renewal, the reenchantment of politics. So this is, I think that maybe social science can contribute to this reenchantment. And this is what I'm going to try to say tonight. So I will deal on the one hand with politics, democracy, and in Europe, excuse me, it's a little bit ethnocentrical, and on the other, but we are here at La Maison Française, so it could be even a duty to be ethnocentrical, and so to connect political analysis and sociological analysis, to say it like that. My first point will be about politics. As we all think, and maybe this could be discussed, the idea of democracy came from old Greece, with Clisthène, Solon, and then arrived to Rome, then was part of the European spirit, then went to America, Western world, as we say, and today the idea of democracy, this is the classical way to speak, is supposed to be good for the whole world. In fact, it is maybe not so true historically. If you read Amartya Sen, and for me a very important author, if you read Amartya Sen, he said, well, the idea of democracy, you can find it also in Africa, you can find it also in India, and so it's not necessarily this classical image, but okay. So if you consider Western Europe, the idea of democracy has been strong since many, many centuries. Of course, you can say that it was there in the old times, but what is important for what I'm going to present now is the fact that during the classical industrial era, the idea of democracy became connected with the social in a very important way, and this is my starting point. If you want to understand the growth of democracy in Europe, and maybe here, the growth of the idea of democracy, you have to consider what happened socially within the industrial society. At the time of industrialization, that is to say, at the time when a social conflict structured collective life, the conflict between the working class movement and the masters of industry. Because with this conflict, which was a social conflict between social actors, the masters of industry, and the trade unions, the workers. This conflict was social but had political dimensions or political correspondence. And this is how the left, from my point of view, became so influential in many countries. And here, two models appeared, two twin models, or two, you can say, the mother and the child, or the brother and the sister, two models of democracy and political action connected with social issue could develop in Europe during the second half of the 19th century and after, and this is the starting point. On the one hand, social democracy, and on the other hand, what became communism. Social democracy, from my point of view, is very difficult because you can define it as a concept or you can define it historically. And it's not necessarily exactly the same. But historically, social democracy was a strong working class movement, strong trade unions, if you prefer, and a political party which is the expression of the trade unions. You can have it in Scandinavia, you could have it in Germany. In England it was a little bit different, but it was not so far from this kind of idea. A strong social force which is expressed politically by a party which is the correspondence at the political level of the social movement. So the first model was social democracy with two characteristics. The first one is that the political party is supposed to be the expression of the trade unions, and the second characteristic is that the political party is democratic, is willing to win the power, to get access to power through elections, through negotiation, through debate, not through violent rupture. The second model is what you can call the communist model, which is a model where the political party is supposed to get access to power, including, not necessarily, but including through violence, through revolution. And what happened with the communist model is that there has been a kind of reversal, because there was rather quickly, and this was true obviously after 1917, after the Russian Revolution, the Communist Party is supposed to be more important than the social movement, than the trade unions, and much more important, so that sometimes the Communist Party considered that the working class, that the trade unions are not important and should not be more than, I don't know the English expression, la courroie de transmission.
Transmission belt.
The transmission belt of the party. It's the contrary of the previous model. I don't have time to be more precise, this is not very important. What is important is that today, in Western Europe at least, it is no longer possible to dream to these models. Communism is, from my point of view, disappearing. Of course, you will meet some communists somewhere, you will meet some communist party somewhere. In my country, the Communist Party still exists. In Italy, it does not exist anymore as such, the name has changed. But in my country, for instance, after the Second World War, the Communist Party was the more important political force in the country, with 26 or 28% of the voters at the first elections. Today, it's 3 or 4% of the voters. And there is no capacity to mobilize, no capacity to propose a future through this model. So it's the end, from my point of view, it's the end of communism. And social democracy also is declining in Europe. It's declining maybe not as an ideal, like a dream, but it's declining for two reasons. The main one is that there are no longer strong trade unions able to support a political party. I will take the French case, which is very clear. In France today, no more than 7% and maybe less of the workers belong to trade unions. 7%. And where do they work, these people? Not so much in industry, much more as civil servants for the state, as school teachers, I mean, in the administration, much more than in the industry. So it means that there is not anymore the social movement which can be expressed in a political action. And the second point is that, I forgot to say that, but is that social democracy means the welfare state, or something like that. And today, we know, after so many years of neoliberalism and so on, we know that it's more and more difficult to have a welfare state. But the main reason is the decline of the social force that was corresponding to the political force. So for this reason, the left, in a country like my country, and it is true also in Italy and in many other countries, I'm sure, the left today has lost its two main political models. So it's difficult to be strong in elections if you don't have such important models. And the problem for the left, and this is what I'm now trying to present, will be to propose something new in a situation when the two classical models collapsed, declined, disappeared. It is not totally true that nothing new was tested. in the late 90s, in 3 countries, you had some people that tried to propose something that you could consider as something new. In this country, Clinton. In Germany, Schroeder. And in England, and he's a more famous one, Tony Blair with the third way, a sociologist, helped him a lot, Anthony Giddens, which means that sometimes social scientists are directly connected with politics, not always. So, it is true that there was something which was tested in order to create something new. But as you know, even Anthony Giddens says that it is finished. Maybe you have read some articles by Anthony Giddens, not so, rather recently, where he explains that it's finished. So the problem is that today, the left, or the people that feel more left than right, it has to be reinvented, recreated, in a situation where so many things have changed. I will be a little bit more precise within 1 second. But on the one hand, today, it is no longer possible to think politically like people used to think in the 50s or in the 60s, for one very big reason, which is that the framework can no longer be only or mainly the national state. Maybe you know a very important German sociologist, Ulrich Beck. He has a wonderful expression. He says, we must finish with methodological nationalism. That is to say, we must not consider that the nation, or the nation state, is necessarily the framework for any political or sociological analysis. Because globalization, and also because, for instance, the building of Europe, or this kind of regional unions, but mainly because many problems today are global. Many problems need to be seen at a global level, and not only at the level of the nation state, and this is going with the level of the nation state, or within the framework of what some political scientists call the Westphalian Model. That is to say, maybe you remember that in 1648, in Europe, there was a Westphalian treaties that decided that the world, in fact Europe, should be organized in nations and with international relations. So this model, nations and international relations, is not able to help us to understand so many issues, ecological issues, justice, global justice. I mean, many problems we must think at a global level and not within the framework of the nation state. But politics are national. I mean, when you vote for a political party, it is within the framework of your nation state. So how can we do to make politics if the framework for political action can no longer be only or mainly maybe the nation state? These are the first reasons that make difficult the reconstruction of the left. And there is another set of reasons that I will be precise now, that make the reconstruction of the left difficult. It is that today you have more and more issues that are not classical, that are new, but that oblige the left to define some position. Religion and culture are becoming more and more important in our collective life. And the left is rather able to deal with economy, social, with problems of pensions, problem of social exclusion, problem of exploitation at the workplace and so on. But when you have to deal with religion, when you have to deal with identities, when you have to deal with memories, all these issues, the left is not so automatically able to propose clear answers. So, on the one hand, globalization and its consequences for the framework of political action. And on the other hand, the development of new issues, of new problems, religion and culture, all this make difficult, really, for the left, the réenchantement that is necessary for it. So this was my first point, just to tell you it's not so easy to make proposals to the left. My second point, I would like to give you my perception of the evolution of the social science. I told you the social science, we here, most of us here, are supposed, we could maybe contribute to this renewal of ideas. What happened within the social science from my point of view? I will start with the 60s, or the late 50s, but the 60s. The 60s were a kind of golden era. Of course, we must always be careful when we speak of the past in terms of golden time, wonderful time. It's always mythical. We know that in social science. But there was something very important. At that time, the social science were providing very general ideas and not only precise and limited knowledges. At that time, for instance, in this country, there was a cathedral built by Parsons. The young generations don't study Parsons anymore, but my generation had to read Parsons. It was very complex, and it was a cathedral, a huge construction with Durkheim, Max Weber, Marshall, and so on, and it's a huge cathedral. But it was not the only general theory for social scientists. You could be or not a Marxist. You could be or not a structuralist. You could be a Marxist and at the same time structuralist. You could be sometimes Marxist and structuralist and functionalist. So I don't want to discuss all this, but there was a theoretical level. Maybe this theoretical level was full with ideology, but it existed, which meant that you could be a researcher in social science, working on a precise issue. You could be interested by, I don't know, education, for instance, or health, or guns, or whatever. Your work, which was limited, necessarily limited, could be part of a very general theory. You could say, I am working on education and I am a functionalist, or and I am a Marxist. So you could start from a precise problem or issue and go to general political and historical theory. And this was very important. Because you didn't have only the possibility to go from limited issue to more general perspectives, or from general perspective to more limited issue. You could also participate in general debates, Marxist, non-Marxist, and so on. In my country, for instance, people, it was very classical thing, you have to choose Raymond Aron or Jean-Paul Sartre, just to give you examples of big theories. So this was the situation in the 60s. And in the early 70s, it was still the case. But then things started to change. And we have been living during the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, a kind of decomposition of this classical model of social science, a kind of disaggregation. And not only a disaggregation of this model, but a disaggregation of the idea to have models, to have general patterns, general ways to analyze. Of course, I know more what was at stake in sociology than in other disciplines, but I know that it is more or less what happened in anthropology, for instance, or in linguistics, for instance, and in other disciplines. So what happened? First, rather soon, some people say, oh, there is a crisis in the social science. It's very interesting. Today, nobody says that there is a crisis in the social science. But at that time, some people said, there is a crisis. I remember a very, very good and famous book by Alvin Goodner. The title is very interesting. The Coming Crisis, so it's not totally the crisis, it's coming. The Coming Crisis of Western Sociology. It's very interesting because and this was published in the very early 70s. It's very interesting because this book by Goodner is explaining why Parsons should be totally forgotten. It's the idea. And it's very interesting. It's a demonstration, because it's really a very good sociological demonstration, was that so many things were happening in America at that time. The Vietnam War, after the movement for the civil rights and so on, so many social and political movements were happening in this society that the general model of Parsons could not work anymore. So this was a thesis by Ecole. Just a parenthesis, it is very interesting today to see that Merton, who was the other great functionalist, at that time, Merton did not propose a big cathedral like Parsons. He proposed middle range theory, you know. So at that time, he was not as honored as Parsons was. But today, Merton is coming back, and Parsons is not coming back. But this is a parenthesis for those who have an interest in the history of ideas. So the first idea of a crisis came when people say it's Parsons, it's finished. After that, you have some people that try to also to propose a réenchantement of Parsons. My friend Jeffrey Alexander tried to propose a new cathedral, but he collapsed it, and he recognized that it was not possible. So, 20 years after, there was another formulation of this idea of a crisis, and you can find it in different texts. But the more interesting, from my point of view, is another sociologist whose name is Irving Horowitz, who published a book, the title of which is The Decomposition of Sociology. So it's not the coming crisis, it's now the decomposition. And the main idea is that sociology is being in a process of decomposition because it is less and less universalist. It is more and more dominated by relativism. That is to say, by limited sociologists that don't connect together in a more general framework. And reading Horowitz makes me remember I did not come recently in a bookshop, in an American university bookshop, but a few years ago, going in an American university bookshop was very interesting for a sociologist. You go to the sociology department, very old books, très poussiéreux, full of dust, Parsons, nothing very new, let us say that. Then you go to Holocaust studies, gay and lesbian studies, African American studies, gay and lesbian studies, and that is to say, you don't have sociology as a universal discipline, you have specific issues, and this can lead very quickly to relativism, that is to say, forgetting universal values. So it's very interesting to read this, but and this movement of decomposition, you can make it describe it in a little bit more precise way, adding some points. First of all, this decomposition meant that many social scientists said, okay, let us forget great theory, les grands récits. Let us forget it. Small is beautiful, also for social scientists. Let us go far from politics. Let us go far from history. For instance, it was during the 70s, but much more 80s and 90s, in my country at least, many people had a strong interest for all this family of sociology that you can call, I know that there are big differences, but it's the same family, ethnomethodology, phenomenological sociology, the so-called school of Palo Alto. I mean, all this kind of sociology. And it's very interesting, for me the best sociologist in this family of thought was Goffman. And Goffman used to say very clearly, yes, I know my sociology has nothing to do with politics. My sociology has nothing to do with history. I know it. I am not interested in my work by politics or history. He did not say that small is beautiful, but he wanted to study limited interactions and things like that. So you had this. You had other people that say, well, there is no more society. We just have emptiness. We don't have any more society. We just have individuals. And it was a moment when some people said, let us develop the project of methodological individualism. This kind of ideas became rather strong. So the main spiral was a spiral of decomposition of sociology. And so, as I tried to say, it started in the early 70s, and it is not finished today. But there was another spiral that was taking place, not as visible, but this is a spiral that I would like to promote, a spiral of reconstruction of something. And I would like to say that this reconstruction, for me, there were two interesting stages. I don't want any misunderstanding. I will not defend the ideas that I'm going to quote now, but for me they were part of the idea that we should reconstruct or rebuild something. The first idea, which was very influential in the 80s and 90s, was the idea of postmodernity. Today it's finished. Today, I mean, it's finished. If you say, if you are a student, and if you say that you are going to write about postmodernity, it's not fashionable. Don't do that if you're a student. It's old style, I would say. But it was very interesting. It was interesting because it introduced a debate. What does it mean, postmodernity? It's modernity, but it's after modernity, but connected with modernity. And for me, it's the idea that the new era is made of tensions between identities, emotions, passions, and so on the one hand, and, let us say, universal values, law, right, and reason. So there was some debate about postmodernity. And the second moment, which was interesting for me, more recently, but unfortunately the main sociologist here died, was the idea of multiple modernities. It's a Shmuel Eisenstadt, who died a few months ago. Eisenstadt, who had been close to Parsons in the 60s or something like that. But he developed this idea because he did not like a very important Parsonian idea, which was the idea of convergence and modernization. That is to say, all societies more or less should converge in the same kind of model of modernity. And there is a kind of evolution that makes that all society will become modern, more or less the same. And what Eisenstadt says is there are several modernities, multiple modernity. Of course, this introduced a very interesting debate. Shouldn't we think that there is only one modernity, but different paths of modernity, different ways of modernization? We can discuss this kind of thing. But for me, it's the beginning of the reconstruction. But this is not enough, and this is why I would like to introduce more precise and maybe more interesting idea. And here is what for me is a new image that we can have for social science. So, if you accept this image of decomposition and crisis on the one hand, some some efforts to discuss postmodernity, multiple modernity. But if you want to see what is really new and building this spiral of reconstruction, I think that you must go and study take into account two different issues that seem totally opposite and that in fact are connected. The first important point is the idea of globalization, and the second important point is the idea of individual, subject, the individual as a subject. So on the one hand, globalization, which is very general, very large, and on the other hand, the idea of subject, which is very singular, particular. I think that the two ideas are connected. I will say why within a few seconds. So my first point is that today, more and more, we are obliged not to analyze globalization, but to think globally. It's not exactly the same. I consider that globalization as a phenomenon, it's for economists much more than for other people. They can study the economy today as global. But for other social scientists, if you want to consider economy as a social science, for other social scientists, I think that the problem is not to analyze globalization. It is to be able to analyze social issues from a global perspective. That is to say, taking into account various levels of analysis from the more general, the global, the world if you want, to the more local. And this is very important. For instance, many phenomena that seem to be only local, if you take this perspective, and if you try to think global, you will understand it differently. So many problems, the law, the culture, the social issues, so many problems can be very local, and at the same time, you cannot really understand them if you don't take into account the more general dimensions of these problems. So this first idea that globalization means that we must think globally, this idea is more and more accepted within the social science. Not everybody, and of course, and it's not as clear in some countries as it is in other countries. For example, in my country, the people did not want to discuss globalization until recently. And we invented another word in France. We say mondialisation. We don't say globalization, and it's for me it's a kind of resistance to this. But okay. So on the one hand, I think that more and more people accept this idea that it's useful to analyze even very limited phenomena, taking into account various levels of analysis, including the more general, but that you can call the global one, on the one hand. And on the other hand, there is a huge tendency within the social science, and it started in the 80s, there is a huge tendency to take seriously into account the notion of subjectivity, subjectivation, desubjectivation. You have a new vocabulary or a renewed vocabulary that try to take all these categories seriously. That is to say, to try to understand what is social life, starting from the perspective of the individual as a subject, that is to say, as able to become an actor. A subject is a quality, which means the capacity of action. It is not because, but you are not necessarily an actor if you are a subject, but you have maybe this capacity, or you would like to have this capacity. I don't have time to be more precise, but I just want to give a certain number of examples of this. If you take people working on religion, they will tell you in the past, religion was dominated by logics of reproduction. Parents were Catholic, or Muslim, or Jews, or this or that, so children are Catholic, Muslim. Today, more and more people say, my religion is my personal choice as a subject. I have many friends that work in the French suburbs and that study the youth in the French suburbs. Many of the young people are Muslim. And when they ask to young people, you are Muslim, can you explain me what does it mean? What is it? The answer very frequently is, it's my choice, it's my decision. Of course, they will say something about the parents, the grandfathers, and so on, of course. But the idea that it is a personal decision, the religion is connected with their subjectivity. And this is why people can change, can pass from a religion to another religion. I will give you a very French and very limited but interesting example. Maybe you have heard that in France we had affairs of burqa, total veil, woman with a... Most of the women that have been interviewed, I don't say all the women, but most of the women that have been interviewed by social scientists. I have two students that make their PhD on this. They were Catholic. They were Catholic and very French. So they became Muslim and hardliner, if I can say it like that. So it is very interesting. It means it's a personal choice. Why and how? This is another problem. So religion has something to do more and more with subjectivity. Now let me take another case. Work. When I was a student, when we were dealing with work, it meant exploitation. It makes social relations in the factories, at the workplace, domination. today, when the idea of work is, in the French debate at least, is discussed, it's not so much exploitation, it's something different. It's the idea that work should mean creativity, capacity to build his or her own trajectory, to be master of what you do and so on. But sometimes it is not possible, and sometimes it is so impossible that you will have the feeling to be harassed or to be or to suffer. The idea of suffering is very important. And the more extreme case here is when people commit suicide at the workplace. We had a lot of debate in France about this issue, because when people commit suicide at the workplace, it means something about work. But if you commit suicide, you act as an individual, and you act as a subject that cannot exist or that cannot be transformed into an actor. So you can connect this idea of this way of thinking about work with the idea of subjectivity. I could take many other examples. For instance, today, many people, many social scientists say it's very important to study the body, to study what people do with their body, or what people want to do with their body. It's totally different than what was said 30 or 40 years ago. The body, 30 or 40 years ago, was mainly, in the sociological literature, the body of exploited workers, suffering, being ill. So this is why medicine was so important, and so hygiene was so important. So today it's different. People that study the body say, it's very interesting because with the dance, the sport, with tattoo, with piercing, and that, people want to master their own body and to do something with their body and to express something through their body. It's their subjectivity, So, I could take many, many other cases or examples. I will say it a little bit differently now. Classically, when you say I have an interest for education, you study the system, the educational system. When you have an interest for health, you study the medical system. More and more people say, no, what is important also is to study not only the educational system, but the student or the pupil as such, or to study not only the medical system, but to study the ill person. Not only illness, but the ill, and to take it seriously too. And if you listen, to take another example, all these people that work on identities, a notion that we could discuss, many people will say that working on identity means understanding why people have the feeling to be victims, for instance. It's recent. The notion of victim, which is connected, which is not so far from the notion of subject. It did not exist, or almost not, 40 years ago. So, I don't want to be too long here, but I think this is what I wanted to tell you. It's by myself. I think that the reconstruction of social science has a lot to do with the capacity of the researchers to deal with two extreme opposite categories, globalization and subjectivity. And as I told you, the two are not only opposite, you are not écartelé, I don't English word, you are not like that, only. Because I think that the more you live in a global world, the more maybe you will try to exist as a subject in order to face this global world. And this is why the debate about human rights is so important, because human rights is a very local issue, but it's also a global issue. Very, very quickly or very easily. So, at that stage, remember, I started with the crisis of the left, of the models for the left. I don't say that there is a crisis for social science today. When people try to say that there is a crisis for social science, they are right, but it's not an intellectual problem. It's much more an institutional problem or a problem of work. I mean, I'm sure that it is more or less the same in this country. So many people have got a PhD and then they don't find a job. I was reading recently some statistics, it's very interesting. In the past, you had much more, in proportion, much more people with a tenure or with a stable position than today. So these are real problems. But intellectually, I don't hear people saying that we are social scientists in an intellectual crisis. This is not a big problem. And my idea now, and I'm not so, my idea is to say, try to see if, as I told you, if social science, as they are today, after this decomposition, beginning to be rebuilt with these notions of globalization and this notion of subject, and many other notions of food, couldn't there be an element in order to contribute to rebuild a political life on the left? And it's not so easy. There's a lot of problems, but it is clear that we bring knowledge. That's the first one. I will take the French debates. We are debating today, for instance, about Islam. It's an obsession in France. Islam is a very central issue in my country. Okay. But if we want to debate seriously and to make good politics, as far as Islam is at stake, and maybe we don't know exactly, but people say that there are maybe 5 or 6 million Muslim people in my country, it's a lot. So if you want to take it, we must know what it is, Islam, and how people become Muslims, or are Muslim, or want to know more to be Muslim, and how they connect their Islam with what is at stake in other countries. And so we need social research, social science, we need research, and many people do it very, very well. And so in many cases, social science can bring some light on the problems that are discussed at the political level. The problem for the left, and it is the same for the right, that on many issues, people don't know what is to be left and what is not to be left, what is to be right. If you say laïcité, I take the French debate. If you take nation, if you take Islam, if you take religion, if you take cultural identities, if you take multiculturalism, etc., you will meet very important oppositions, conflicts within the left and within the right. So how social science can be helpful if all these issues are very conflictual and if you have a lot of contradiction. Now, in order not to bring a solution, but just to give an example, I will take one issue just to try to see how we can discuss this problem. Just one example. But before taking this example, I just want to add something. One of the problems is the problem of categories, that is the problem of vocabulary. When we face all these new issues, or recent issues, at least in my country, it appears that we don't have the good words. So what do we do when we don't have the good words? We create new words. So we use a lot of post, neo, trans, all these small elements that you put just before. You understand? It's not exactly, it has something to do, it's much less, it is called meta, infra, supra, so all this way to try to create some new vocabulary. And the second problem for me, and here it's worse, a very important problem, is that we use in the social science sometimes the same words that are used in the public debate. My example will be also an example on this problem. I would like to finish to take the example of the notion of integration, because it's a very classical notion for sociology or social science, and it's part of the public debate. In my country, it's very obvious. I want to say something which will be maybe very rude or very excessive, but I consider that the notion of integration, from a sociological perspective, is very classical, old-fashioned, and we should forget it, or almost, and from a political perspective, is reactionary. So you can be shocked, but I will try to, I say it in a very extreme way, just to open the discussion, but just to tell you how the social science can bring maybe something. If you take the social science, if you take Durkheim or Parsons, the classical authors, they use a lot this idea of integration, the idea being that the more a society is integrated, the better. The less, for instance, people will commit suicide. Suicide, Durkheim's demonstration, you can discuss it or not, but Durkheim's demonstration about suicide, suicide is connected with a less integrated collective way of life, something like that. So, the idea of integration in classical sociology is connected with the idea of society in its totality. The problem is society. The problem is not the people, the individual. Of course, with the idea of integration, what comes is with it is the idea of socialization of individual, and if you are socialized, then you will become an individual. But the main purpose is the society as a whole. This is what is important. This is why the classical sociology dealing with this idea of integration, when it studies migrants, has no interest for the country where migrants are coming from, and has no interest for the trajectory of the migrants between the point of departure and the point of arrival. What is important is not the migrant. What is important is the integration of the society. So it is not important to know if these people suffer or if they don't suffer. It's not important to know if these people are building something new or not, if they are creative, if they are bringing new forms of culture, if they are creating new networks. No. The problem is society more or less integrated? This is for me not so good sociology, I must say, because I think that the thing which are more interesting when you have an interest for migrants is to know how they do. Do they go in a country in order to cross this country, transit, or to stay in the country? Do they go back? Do they participate in networks? Do they have the feeling of building a diaspora? Do they participate in new cultural invention? I mean, so many things can be said about migrants that are very important. Are they able to build their own life or not, and so on? So, if you deal with the notion of integration, this is not important. You deal only with society as a totality. So, for me, social science, when they use this notion of integration, la sociological intégration, you have books like this in France, it's a very classical sociology that does not understand what is new at the world level and what is new when you take into account the subjectivity of people, on the one hand. Now listen to the political discourse. In my country, it's very, very interesting. Integration is used in order to say to migrants, because this is what is at stake. You must be integrated. And if you don't want to be integrated, go back in your country. And if you don't want to be integrated, I will send you the police, because that's all that I can do. So integration in my country is connected with two things. It's a discourse, very incantatory, because it does not work. And as it does not work, because people say, you asked me to be integrated, but I don't have any resource for it. I don't have a job. I am a victim of racism. I am living in a ghetto. And how do you want me to be integrated if you don't give me the possibility to be integrated? So see, it's a discourse that does not work. So the discourse does not work. So people say, I don't agree. And there is a moment when you have riots, when the suburbs, the so-called suburbs, during 3 weeks, which was the case 5 years ago, are in a situation of total violence and so on. And what do the power do? The only thing to do is to send the police or the army. I mean, to that repression. And if you listen, you will see that this discourse of integration is more and more used by politicians when they don't have any other solution, real solution, to these so-called problems of suburbs, banlieue, and so on. This is so true that people try to find models of integration and don't find them. And here, and I will finish with this because I don't want to talk too much. And here it's very interesting to have in mind it's a story, it's a real story. In July 2005 in London, as you may remember, there were terrorist attacks. The first one succeeded, the second one failed, but it was clear very quickly that the people that made these attacks were not coming from abroad, like the people that have done September 11. No, they were born in England. And so this was perceived as a consequence of the British or English model of integration, which was described as community, communitarist, I don't know how to say it in English very well, but this model, the Londonist tongue, as was said at that time, you know, this possibility for Islam preachers in churches to say awful things, and this model did not work. And so in the French newspapers, you had some intellectuals and political actors that wrote the articles, say, look at these English people or British people, they were so proud of their model. Our French model is quite better, we don't have terrorist attack now. But 3 months after, in France, we had, in the suburbs, during 3 weeks, these riots. And in the English daily newspapers, you could find articles saying, well, the French with their model républicain d'intégration, it's not better. And both were right. I mean, there is no model that works. And if you go to a country like the Netherlands, they had this kind of model, British style, if you want. And people said, oh no, it does not work, we don't want it anymore. So today I think that the idea of model d'intégration, integrative model, this idea itself does not work. And the problem for me is not to create new models. The problem is to develop new politics, new policies. And new policies, not policies to integrate people, but to give to the people, to migrants, resources in order for them to build their own life, and then maybe, but this is not the problem for me, to be integrated. So I wanted just to take this example, we could discuss other cases, where on the one hand, sociological analysis can provide different perspectives, classical or new, and political discourse and action can provide also an illustration which is very in a kind of correspondence. And I think that political actors, if they want to build a new left, which is my idea, if they want to be something new on the left, they should take very seriously into account the new ways of thinking that are developing in social science. Well, this is what I wanted to propose tonight for discussion with you. Thank you very much.
What happened? We used to have a longer table here. This is over. I guess we both have to stand up. Well, thank you very much. And the floor is open for questions.
Yeah, ending on your last, also. Okay, thank you very much also. Ending on your last note about a new possibility of politics, and particularly since you mentioned this whole question of integration, I'll make the argument that I've been hearing in the last 2 weeks, that what happened in Tunisia and Egypt, and I'll leave Tunisia open because of the connection with France, that a lot of the myths of Middle East culture have been, shall we say, proven redundant. I'm just wondering if, combined with the latest crisis with your foreign minister about her wonderful connections, whether this could lead to some kind of new beginning of a new paradigm. I don't want to go as far as a new paradigm, but some kind of new interpretation, as you have called for.
I'm sorry, you were speaking about what happened in North Africa, in Egypt, and so on. Well, as a social scientist, for me, it's wonderful. Of course, I am not blind. I understand that some problems could arise, but to say it very briefly, I have the same feelings that I had when solidarity appeared in Poland in 1980s. I remember some people say, well, but these people are Catholics, are bigots, and so on. Maybe, but it was a wonderful social movement, and it was the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Empire. So, in front of this, if you take the French case, it's a caricature. The French political leaders not only did not understand, not only did not imagine anything, but had a stupid behavior. I give you not the extreme case that you quote, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, going to Tunisia during the event and meeting some very rich friend of the president, and going in the private plane of this person, and what was said yesterday in the newspaper, and visiting this very rich person, friend of Ben Ali, in order to buy some stocks from a Tunisian. I mean, the minister friend. But this is a second case, maybe much more interesting. The prime minister, when Mubarak said, "I finished, I quit," he said, we must consider that this man did it with a very elegant way. So you have a popular movement, you have a social movement, you have a democratic movement, and so on, and you have political power, not only elites, but power that don't understand, So it's very interesting to say it would be great on the left, which is my side, if people could understand better. The problem is that they don't understand so much better. I arrived yesterday, and in the plane I read a newspaper with a long interview of somebody who was Minister of Foreign Affairs with the left, and I was absolutely shocked, because listen to what he said. He said, what happened in Tunisia was unpredictable, totally unpredictable. Now let me tell you what will happen during the next 20 years. So, this arrogance of somebody who said, what happened yesterday was unpredictable, but I can tell you that during the next 10 or 20 years. So, we must finish with this. I mean, we must not accept. Of course, the knowledge that we can bring are not perfect, but if you read, it's very interesting, if you read what researchers that know what is at stake in Egypt or in Tunisia, you learn a lot. I have read wonderful articles by gauche specialists. I give just one example to finish. There is a very, very well-known specialist, French specialist, with Olivier Wieviorka. He's very good. I read a very interesting article because people were saying, oh, but isn't it possible that in Egypt or in Tunisia, this movement became an Islamist movement and a big danger for and so on. And he said, the people that are in the street in Egypt today are the same people that protested in Iran 1 year ago against the Muslim power. Well, he knew exactly what was at stake in both countries. That's more interesting than just, they will become Islamist and maybe Islam will come, I don't know. But at least, so this is why I consider that we, as social scientists, we can participate much more in the public debate with solid ideas. The time is no longer the time when Sartre could go to Japan, Jean-Paul Sartre, could go to Japan and give very famous lectures about what is to be an intellectual. And he said, an intellectual is somebody qui s'occupe de ce qui ne le regarde pas.
What doesn't concern you?
Okay. No, today, as social scientists, we have to express ourselves when we are concerned, because we know, because we have met Philware, so this is.
Thank you very much.
Yes, do you need this?
Oh yeah, it would be better.
I don't think so.
It's not going to go that far.
So my question is, if social science has a certain influence in politics, isn't it the case when there's a certain consensus within the social science and thereby a certain power, and this power builds on, isn't there a conflict of your argument of the subjective, empathic style of research and this power you need to influence the discourse.
Well, you are absolutely right. Social science are not monolithical. There are big tensions. I am a disciple of Alain Touraine. It was a question of death and life with Bourdieu. Between Touraine and Bourdieu, it was a question of really. So I'm not like that, but I feel far from the disciples of Bourdieu, even if I can have very good friends among them. So of course you have big differences, but you have the possibility. A good social scientist is able to discuss with other people, not necessarily to find an agreement, but to know better what is the opposition between the two. And then what is important is the knowledge that we shall bring. The problem is not to know if Touraine is right or if Bourdieu is right. The problem is on such or such issue, what does the research made by Touraine bring, and what the research, and I will be more precise in a second, and what the research made by Bourdieu brings. I give an example. In one of the last important books by Bourdieu was called La Domination Masculine, the male domination. I don't know how it was translated.
That's good.
So it's a book where Bourdieu says something like, I exaggerate a little bit, women are victims of symbolic violence. They are dominated so much by men that they interiorize the categories of the dominant. When you interiorize the category of the dominant, you cannot think by yourself. So it means that there is no feminism and no possible action for women if they interiorize totally the domination.
No.
I exaggerate.
Say that.
No, I exaggerate. I know. I told you.
He says they should get organized.
No, but it's not possible. But he said it's not possible. Theoretically, it's not possible. And I remember because in my center we had a very strong feminist among, for instance, Françoise Gaspard. She was really fond of Bourdieu. But this book, she said no. He said that I cannot exist. So, but no, what Touraine did was totally different. 10 years after, or 5 years after, he published a book which is the title in French is Le Monde des Femmes, the world of women. And he made a fieldwork with women. And he said woman wants to be subject and so on. Okay. I don't say, even if I have my opinion, I don't say you must follow Touraine and forget Bourdieu. I just say, take what Bourdieu say and try to see if it is useful for you in order to think politically or to think, for instance, as a feminist. And take what Touraine says. So that's it. But it is true that it's very conflictual. And to follow what you said, listening to you, I was thinking, economists are much more monolithical than other social scientists. There is a so-called mainstream. It's very interesting because this mainstream was absolutely not able to think what happened in 2008 with the crisis. But there was a kind of consensus among economists to think more or less in the same way. So it's better to have conflicts, differences, and so on, and debate. But what I think is that what we can bring to politicians or to political life is not we social scientists all agree on this and that. No, it's to tell them things are not so easy. These are two perspectives or three different perspectives. So you should take this into account and try to find your way taking this into account. So I agree with you. There is no consensus, and there should not be a consensus in our disciplines.
I'm going to put myself on the list. I just called on myself. I'm thinking about, I agree with much of the diagnosis that you described. And I have two questions. I don't know if they really interrelate. The first, well, let's see. Well, with regards to the left and a trajectory or what could, in some sense, what kind of reenchantment of politics or what would revitalize? I mean, in a way, it's sort of unclear what the left, the concept, needs as a result of your analysis. So I would think that on that one issue or one dimension of this project would be, it would have to entail articulation, at least, of some projects or principles or norms. Sorry, I still use the word norm. Well, let's put it that way, projects that would differentiate a left from a non-left. I don't think that's impossible to do. I don't think it's possible to do at all, but I think that would have to be, in other words, not necessarily a grand social theory which has, the truth in its back pocket, etc., but this dimension is indispensable. And then the second thing would be, and I also don't think it would be impossible to do, how would that link up with, or how could you link that up with some of these dimensions that you mentioned? For example, the issue of the subject. Now, I don't take this is not the Foucauldian discourse of subjectivation as the effect of power. It's the opposite, obviously. But what's really interesting to me is the way in which you described behind the border in France, you find a Catholic. No, but what I mean by that is that, or you go and you find out about this discourse of religion, it's my choice. That sounds to me like something that another sociologist diagnosed, actually, namely Jose Castova. It sounds like the denominalization, I have nothing to say, denominationalism, from church to denomination. Of religion, also of, as you describe it, of Muslims in France. And that's a huge community. And so that means two things: voluntary choice, voluntary association, and of who? Well, supposedly the subject. So in other words, not simply being the product of, as you said, of the parent. How would you link these up? I mean, it's a fascinating idea. That also means, of course, that the voluntary part would, in some sense, prevail over the coercive part, which is still there, this spiritual coercion. So I'm curious, I mean, I think that the burden would be, although, again, I do think it's possible, to articulate a conception, because you have to do that. In other words, the absence of grand theory, it's the absence of a articulatable project to mobilize people. So I'm wondering how you put that together, which is of course impossible.
It will not be a perfect answer, because at that stage, as you understand, it's not so easy. I can say, here is the problem. I am not sure that I can say, here is the solution. But I would like to say three things. First of all, I think that we can pass from the individual, the subject as an individual, to the idea of politics if we introduce a very simple idea, which is, you cannot be a subject if you don't consider that everybody should be able to be a subject. So if you admit this principle, then you introduce the notion of collective responsibility. So the idea that the role of politicians is to create the condition so that everybody could be considered as a subject and could be given as much as possible conditions to be a subject. So this would be my first point. My second point is that if dealing with this notion of subject, if we want left to take seriously the idea of subjectivity, subject, and so on, of course we are not in the classical image of left like big groups, collectivity, and so on. But it is possible to connect the idea of collective responsibility and the idea of individual and subjectivity. I give you an example. I have been proposing to the Socialist Party. I am not a member of the Socialist Party, but I discussed, and this will be my third point, I discussed a lot with them. I propose them to introduce the notion of, I say it in French, service public personnalisé. Public service, but taking into account each individual. That is to say, the French like very much a notion of public service. It's very French, and so on. But if you accept to be in France now, for this example, it means that the public service should not be something which is done by anonymous people and that treat everybody anonymously. It's possible to take seriously each person as such, each worker on the one hand, and each people that want to be a customer of railways transportation or whatever. So the idea of service public personalization is this kind of idea that try to connect the two dimensions. But now I will go to my main and the third point, which is if my ideas could be useful, it means that the relationship between intellectuals or researchers and politicians or political actors or political parties should be renewed. And my idea is that, well, in the French, I will say it like that. In the French debate, many people used to say, left has no idea. The left, it is not true. If you go on blogs, internet, if you read the pages, ideas, opinion, and so on in the newspaper, every day you have lots of ideas. The problem is not the deficit of ideas. The problem is how can you create dynamic between intellectual researchers, the men that produce or bring the ideas, and politicians. And this is not so easy. But you must create places where people discuss, places where people work together. The problem is that politicians have no time. And the problem is that intellectual researchers say things are very complex, and politicians say we need very simple ideas. But my experience is that it is possible to have this kind of, but it takes time, it's not so easy.
You are talking about the depoliticization of the academy. Yes.
I know as a former president of the International Sociological Association, you're very familiar with public sociology, and it sounds like you're advocating for that, not just that social scientists do research that somehow has mysteriously caught the attention of politicians, but that we more actively pursue that attention with our research. Is that what you had in mind in terms of practice? Where do we go with understanding the problem and creating kind of a different worldview where people see global structures and beyond nation states and so on from the research that we do?
Well, first of all, the expression public sociology was coined or at least used by Michel Wieviorka. It's not my expression, but I don't feel so far, and I don't feel really like this because Michel Wieviorka has a political project. It's not the moment to discuss it, which is not my case. So, what is very important for me is to say something. I will say it like that. Is to say that the demonstration in sociology, it is not like in natural science. We don't make experiences. We can the demonstration is in what people do, including politicians, with our work. So, my idea is that we must go not only to politicians, we must go to social actors, we must go to trade unions, we must go to NGOs, we must go to associations, we must go to the people that we study, or to the people that are concerned with what we study. And we must create with these people a dialogue and a dynamic, as I say. So it can be with politicians, but not only. And if it is with politicians, it's very difficult. It's very difficult because, well, Max Weber has said it 1 century ago, because when you are a social scientist, you don't have the same categories exactly to test your ideas than the categories that the politician will use. A politician wants to be re-elected, for instance. Sociologist, it's not the problem. So we don't have exactly the same categories for what is at stake in using some ideas. I don't know if I am answering clearly. What I try to tell you is that the importance is in the relationship and between politicians or other actors, between actors, let us say, and analysts. This relationship, meaning for me that the social scientist should speak because he or she has some precise knowledge on some problem. Sometimes, for instance, in France, the sociologists are very present in the newspapers. So sometimes I receive an invitation to speak about, sometimes, but I don't know anything about this. I remember once a very important newspaper called me and asked me, just like that, Michel Wieviorka, what do you think, comment on dit le crâne?
Skull.
Skull.
The skull. What do you think of Hitler's skull? And at that moment, I remember that I had read in a newspaper 2 or 3 days before that Hitler's skull had been found maybe in some Soviet archives. And I had been making fieldwork at that moment. I was making fieldwork in Russia, but not at all on archive. I was making fieldwork on post-communist social movements. Nothing. So to understand why the journalists called you, it was very difficult. But I had nothing, of course, nothing to say about Hitler's skull. So I told the journalist, you should call Mr. Marc Ferraud, my good friend and historian and so on, and maybe he will tell you something that but this is an extreme case, but it means that we should never do that. We should never answer to this kind of question and never accept this kind of situation. But if you have been working on post-communist social movement and if there is something happening in one of these social movements, it's good to be able to express yourself. And it's good also to be able to express it with the people that will maybe do something with your knowledge. I don't know, the ambassador or the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, whatever. So it's not obvious, it's not easy, but my answer is this. The more we can discuss, present our analysis, it's a little bit like the so-called deliberative or participative democracy. We can bring a lot here. And so I don't believe that the sociologist is somebody that goes and visit a minister and tell to the minister, well, I know exactly what you should do because I have been making. No, this does not work. Maybe Anthony Giddens would do it, I don't know. But it's not like, it's never like that. Because my experience is that you can talk a lot with political actors. They like to discuss, but they will do nothing of what you tell them if you don't create the condition of a real dialectic or dynamic. So it's not very clear what I say maybe, but this is my point is the problem is not to have good ideas, the problem is to create the conditions of a dialogue that makes people use your ideas, maybe, or do something with your ideas.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, so obviously I agree with you that it's always good for people who govern to consult with social scientists. So what I didn't quite see during your talk is how specifically you want to rejuvenate the left, which is, in a bad condition in Europe and elsewhere, by giving them the advice of social scientists. So I wouldn't say that the problem of the left is that its problem is gone away. Communism reacted to capitalism, so did social democracy. The problem is still there, and it's still the answer still needs to be formulated. And I do not quite see how making the problem of the left is that the answer has to be a lot more complex than what communists and social democrats traditionally propose. But that is, of course, also why their message has a much harder time to reach voters who respond much more to the opposite trend, the opposite reaction to the one that you're proposing, namely the right-wing answer, which is to make things easier, at least on the face of it, and they win elections by doing that. So what the left has failed to do is to come up with, an easy enough to understand narrative about how, you can deal with capitalism in a globalized world. And, I was wondering if you have some ideas about how social scientists can help the left to craft, some sort of narrative that would solve the main problem of the left, which is the lack of electoral success. soon as the left governs again, I think it's going to be great for us to help them govern. But I think we also need to help them win if we de-identify as left.
Well, what I have tried to do, to be very concrete, I've been working on a certain number of issues. I cannot work on thousands of issues. I'm not a universal spirit or a universal mind. So I've been working on a certain number of issues, and on each of these issues, this is my book which is published right now, on each of this issue, I say, if my analysis is right, if my data are solid and so on, then being left means maybe doing this or that. So I try to make some kind of proposals. I cannot be more precise. It's 20 pages or 30 pages. But so, on the so-called laicity debate, on integration, on multiculturalism, on the so-called, on the issue of ethics, human rights, I make some proposals which are